Denzel Washington's wife Pauletta had never been one to flaunt her status, wealth, or the fact that her husband was one of the most respected actors in the world. That morning, she was dressed simply tailored slacks, a silk blouse, low heels on, had driven herself in their older sedan to the luxury car dealership in Beverly Hills. Not because she couldn't have called ahead and had the car delivered, but because she enjoyed the process of seeing things for herself, feeling the leather under her fingertips, smelling that distinct scent of a brand new luxury vehicle. The dealership gleamed under the California sun. Floor-to-ceiling glass, making the entire showroom look like a jewelry box filled with polished treasures on wheels. The salesmen inside stood in small clusters, their expensive suits well-tailored, their eyes constantly scanning the door for potential buyers. As Pauletta stepped in, she immediately noticed their quick glances, some assessing, some dismissive, and she knew, from the faint, practiced smile of the receptionist, that she had just been categorized. Her polite greeting was met with the kind of customer service that barely qualified as such, a slow acknowledgement, a distracted glance, and a thin smile before the receptionist returned to typing something on her computer. It was subtle, but Pauletta had lived long enough to know when she was being sized up as not worth the time. Still, she brushed it off and began walking along the showroom floor, admiring the car's sleek convertibles, muscular sports cars, stately sedans, each one shining under the carefully positioned lights. After a few minutes, she approached a silver sedan whose design exuded understated elegance. She leaned inside to take a closer look at the interior, the cream-colored leather, seats with delicate stitching, the dashboard that looked like it had been carved by artisans. That was when she heard it, the low chuckle, followed by a voice that carried just enough for her to catch the words, "She's not buying, she's just looking. Don't waste your time." The words were spoken by one of the salesmen, a tall man with slick-back hair and a gold watch that gleamed under the lights. He was speaking to another salesman, both of them standing near the corner. Pauletta felt her stomach twist, but she remained composed, telling herself it wasn't worth reacting. However, the moment worsened when she straightened up and caught them smirking. One of them stepped toward her, his voice now oozing false politeness. "Can I help you? Find something in your price range?" The words hit her harder than she expected, not because she cared about proving she had money, but because the implication was so condescending, so laced with prejudice and arrogance, that it stripped away any sense of professionalism. She looked at him steadily, her voice calm. "I know exactly what I'm looking for." But before she could continue, the man interrupted. "Our pre-owned section is in the back lot. You might want to start there. The models up here are, well, top tier." His smile was rehearsed, but his tone was dripping with the kind of casual insult that comes from believing you've already summed up a stranger's worth in a glance. Around them, a couple of other customers glanced over, sensing something uncomfortable was happening. Pauletta swallowed the tight knot in her throat, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. She simply nodded once, turned on her heel, and walked toward the exit, her dignity intact but her heart pounding with the sting of humiliation. She didn't notice that one of the junior salesmen, who had been quietly observing, watched her leave with an expression of disapproval. Toward his colleagues, as the glass doors closed behind her, Pauletta reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang only once before the familiar voice of her husband answered, warm and steady. "Hey, baby."
Hey.
"Everything." "Okay." There was a pause before she replied softly, "Can you meet me at the dealership? I think you'll want to see this for yourself." Denzel Washington had always been a man of composure, his calm demeanor often mistaken for passivity, until people learned the hard way that it was anything but. When Pauletta's voice came through the line, quiet but carrying that subtle weight he had come to recognize over decades of marriage, he felt something shift inside him. She wasn't prone to dramatics if she called him about something like this. It mattered. "Which dealership?" he asked, already standing from his desk and grabbing his keys. "Beverly Hills, the one on Wilshire," she replied, her voice still measured, but edged with something he couldn't ignore. He didn't need more details. He could fill in the blanks. 15 minutes later, his black SUV rolled smoothly into the dealership's parking lot. Even before he entered, His presence turned heads. There was something magnetic about Denzel that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with the way he carried himself, shoulders straight, gaze steady, every step measured. Inside, Paleta was waiting by the reception desk. Her posture dignified, despite the way the receptionist still seemed to regard her with polite disinterest. Denzel's eyes swept the showroom once before settling on the two salesmen who stood in the corner, their laughter dying in their throats as they realized who had just walked in. "Baby," he said, kissing Paleta lightly on the cheek. "Which one?" His voice was low, but carried a steel edge that sent a ripple of unease through the air. She tilted her head subtly toward the tall salesman with the slick-back hair and the gold watch, the same one who had spoken to her like she didn't belong there. Denzel nodded once, the kind of nod that promised resolution. He turned and walked toward the man, his movements unhurried but deliberate. "You work here?" Denzel's voice was calm, conversational even, but there was something in it that made the man straighten his posture. "Yes, sir," the salesman said quickly, flashing a smile he hoped looked genuine. "Welcome to my wife came in earlier," Denzel interrupted, his tone still even. She was looking at cars. "You told her to check the pre-owned section in the back, didn't you?" The salesman's smile faltered. I might have suggested no," Denzel said, leaning slightly forward, his eyes locking onto the man's with an intensity that made the room seem smaller. "You didn't suggest, you assumed? You assumed she couldn't afford what's in here? You looked at her, decided who she was, and treated her accordingly. That's not a suggestion. It's disrespect." The air in the dealership thickened. Customers nearby had gone silent, watching. The other salesmen shifted uncomfortably, and even the receptionist had stopped pretending to type. The tall man stammered, "Sir, I didn't mean you did." Denzel cut in, his voice sharper now, "and meaning it is the problem. Let me be clear, my wife has more grace in her little finger than you have in your entire body. She doesn't need to prove a damn thing to anyone in this room. But since you like making snap judgments based on appearances, let's make one now." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a sleek black leather checkbook, placed it on the hood of the very car Paleta had been admiring earlier. "Take this one," he said, his eyes never leaving the salesman's. "Full price. No financing. Today, and you," he pointed directly at the man, "will not make a penny of commission from this sale. Find your manager." The room was silent except for the sound of a nervous cough from somewhere in the back. The salesman's face had drained of color, and his mouth opened and closed like he was searching for a defense that wouldn't come. The junior salesman who had witnessed the earlier exchange stepped forward hesitantly. Addressing Denzel with a respectful tone, "Sir, I can help you with the paperwork." Denzel turned to him and gave a short nod. "Good, let's make it quick." Paleta stood beside him, her hand slipping into his. She felt the sting of the morning's humiliation begin to fade, not because of the car, but because of the way he had stood for her, unshakable and unapologetic. The manager, a middle-aged man in a crisp navy suit, emerged from his glass office at the back of the showroom, his expression caught somewhere between curiosity and alarm. He had clearly sensed that something had gone wrong, not only because the entire dealership had fallen into a strange hush, but also because the tall salesman now stood stiff and pale, his gold watch seeming to weigh his wrist down more heavily than before. "Mr. Washington," the manager began cautiously, extending a hand that Denzel did not immediately take, "I understand there's been some kind of misunderstanding." The word hung in the air like a weak excuse, and Denzel's slow, steady turn of his head toward the man was enough to silence any further attempt at deflection. "There was no misunderstanding," he said plainly. "There was arrogance, there was disrespect, and there was a judgment made on my wife the moment she walked in the door. You run this place, you should be aware of how your people treat customers." The manager's eyes flicked nervously toward Paleta, who stood with a quiet dignity that made his throat tighten. Denzel continued, "We're buying the silver sedan. Full price today. Your junior salesman over there," he motioned toward the young man who had stepped up earlier, "will be handling the sale, not him." His head tilted toward the offending salesman, who now seemed to be shrinking into himself, his earlier smugness having dissolved entirely. The manager, eager to contain what was quickly becoming a public spectacle, nodded hastily. Of course, we'll make that arrangement immediately. But Denzel wasn't finished. And, he added, you'll make sure he understands that when you work in a place like this, you never know who's walking through that door. You'd be someone with more money than you've ever seen. You'd be someone just starting out. Dreaming big could be anyone. You treat every single one of them with the same respect. If he can't learn that, then he doesn't belong here. The words carried an authority that went beyond celebrity. It was the authority of a man who had seen the world strip people down to assumptions and had spent a lifetime defying them. By now, the entire showroom was watching customers, holding their breath. A couple quietly recording the scene on their phones, and employees frozen mid-task. The tall salesman's lips tightened, as if holding back an apology he couldn't quite form. And Denzel, sensing that no genuine contrition would be forthcoming, turned his attention back to the junior salesman. Let's get the paperwork done. The young man nodded quickly and led Denzel and Pauletta to a sleek, polished desk in the corner. As they sat, Pauletta placed a hand gently on her husband's arm, her eyes meeting his with a warmth that spoke volumes. She didn't need the car, didn't care about the spectacle, but she understood exactly what he had done. He had taken the moment back from them, turned it into a lesson, and ensured that the sting she'd felt walking out earlier would be replaced by something far stronger. The junior salesman worked quickly, his hands slightly trembling not from nerves about the sale itself, but from the gravity of what he had just witnessed. This was more than a purchase. It was a statement, one he suspected people would still be talking about long after the car left the showroom. The contract was signed, the payment arranged in full, and the keys, a gleaming set with the brand's emblem, were placed gently in Paulietta's hand. It's yours, the young man said quietly, almost reverently. She smiled, thanked him, and then rose to leave with Denzel, her head high. The earlier humiliation now transformed into a moment of quiet triumph. They walked together toward the glass doors, sunlight spilling in from the street beyond, but just before they reached them, Denzel stopped. The entire room seemed to pause with him. He turned back, his gaze sweeping the showroom until it landed once more on the tall salesman. One more thing, he said, his voice carrying easily across the polished floor. You looked at my wife and saw someone who didn't belong here. Let me tell you something, she belongs anywhere she chooses to be. And you. He let the silence linger heavy and unbroken before finishing. Might want to think about whether you belong in a business where respect is part of the job. Without waiting for a reply, he opened the door for Pauletta. And together, they stepped out into the warm California afternoon. The air outside felt lighter, freer, and as they approached the SUV, Pauletta glanced at him with a faint smile. Oh, you didn't have to do all that, she said softly. Denzel returned the smile, his hand resting briefly at the small of her back. Yeah, he replied. I did. The drive home was quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything worth saying had already been said in that showroom. Still, the story didn't end there. Later that evening, as they sat on their patio with glasses of wine, Pauletta's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was the junior salesman, thanking her for allowing him to handle the sale and letting her know that the incident had sparked a staff meeting at the dealership. According to him, the manager had used the confrontation as an example of why snap judgments could destroy reputations and sales alike, and why respect wasn't negotiable. Pauletta read the message aloud and Denzel chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe that guy will learn something after all. In the days that followed, the incident spread quietly at first, through whispered retellings at the dealership. Then through the customers who had been there and the 2 discreet phone recordings that found their way onto social media. Within a week, the clip had gone viral, not because of the celebrity factor, but because of the way Denzel had handled the moment. Calm, direct, unapologetic. Headlines framed it as a lesson in dignity and respect, and thousands of comments poured in from people sharing their own experiences with prejudice in unexpected places. The dealership, perhaps sensing the PR opportunity, released a carefully worded statement about retraining staff and committing to better customer service. But anyone who had been there knew the truth. The lesson had been delivered by a man who refused to let arrogance stand unchallenged especially when it came at the expense of the woman he loved. And though Pauletta never sought the spotlight for herself, she couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction knowing that, in that moment, her husband had shown the world what respect really looked like.